Minister, welcome to In Conversation.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
The trade war that's been going on seems to have very serious implications for the world, but some people say that it might actually benefit India. Do you agree?
Well, I think it's more complicated than that. First of all, I would say these are trade frictions, and war is a very sharp, strong term. But at one level, they contribute to global volatility, and in that sense, frankly, they're a problem for everyone. At another, it depends what where this is heading, what the outcome is. If it leads to a fairer market access all over the world, we don't know what the outcomes of that could be, but that may not be such a bad thing. There are changes in global supply chains. There are, in fact, more than India, I think actually countries like Vietnam have benefited from that. So I think it's actually a very mixed picture, and we approach it in that spirit.
You say that trade war is too harsh a term, but it involves hundreds of billions of dollars of goods. The tariffs are at 25%, 10%. It's really quite massive, and it might even tip the whole world into recession. So perhaps trade war is not an exaggeration.
If you view the glass which is half empty, yes. But look on the other hand at actually what are the structural linkages. The fact that so many businesses are invested in each other, and the actual globalization that has happened over the last 20, 30 years. So that's not so easy to wish away either. So I think somewhere we need to move away from very sharp, it's going to be sort of the sky is going to fall on our heads, it's the end of the world, versus no, everything is okay, and let's kiss and make up. I don't think either is going to happen.
One of the arguments being made is that this negotiation can only benefit the US because it's really unclear what the US wants from China. In fact, in some ways, it could be argued that we don't even really know what the US wants from all the rest of us, so in Asia, how to make those adjustments. The US has also hit out at India. It also argues there are unfair trade practices with India as well, that India takes too much care, for example, of its cotton farmers.
In a sense, it's for the American foreign minister to define what the US wants, so that's really not my job. What I can say, both objectively...
But do you think it's fair?
No, but objectively would be that the US has made trade much more central to its foreign policy, to its actions in that domain. And it has in many ways been more demanding than it has been in the past. Now, the US obviously believes that what it's doing is fair. That's the American self-assessment. I think for me, it's not an issue of whether you like it or you don't like it. It is an issue of, well, that's the reality, and we have to deal with that. Now, insofar as India is concerned, yes, we've had some sharper trade arguments with the United States. These are ongoing. There are areas where we've reached accommodation. There are still a lot of outstanding issues. What I can tell you is that our trade ministers are in touch with each other, and certainly it would be our hope that they can find common ground on many of those issues. Now, some of the examples that you raised, look, you've got to understand one thing. There's a big difference between a country whose per capita income is 25 times, 50 times ours, versus a country which is really small farmers, subsistence farmers, people whose really not just livelihood, whose existence turn on that one particular issue. And I don't think you can really put everybody in the same boat here.
That's exactly the point, so that China makes as well, that it's so they argue that they're still a developing country as well, whereas America would make the argument is as if you go into all the big cities in both India and China, you see lots and lots of wealthy middle-class people. So it is disingenuous to claim that you need all these preferences which are supposed to be for developing country status.
No, look, again, I think if the Chinese have a case, the Chinese foreign minister should be sitting here and making it before you. I'll make the case for India. Okay, I don't think that's fair. I mean, first of all, come to Indian cities. I suggest to you there is still a difference between Indian cities and American cities. But that's not the yardstick of judgment. I mean, first of all, 60% of your people don't live in cities, maybe more. And then whether your cities are good or not, or whether your metros are better or not, that's not an issue of let us say agriculture, where one country is commercialized, industrialized in its method of production versus another which has really farmers who are scratching a living out of that little plot of land. So I think that's a very sweeping, simplistic view, and obviously a self-serving view. Now, because you are a large developing country, it doesn't make you less developing, it just makes you large. So I think there has to be acceptance of the fact that there are fundamental differences in quality of life, in standards of living across the world.
When the Modi administration makes these points to the Americans, do you think that they are hearing you?
Well, they're hearing it because we make it loudly. I don't know whether they fully accept it. We ourselves have market access issues in China. I run a massive trade deficit with China. It accounts for more than 50% of my trade deficit.
The US-China trade dispute has been going on for more than a year.
Right.
And I think you'd be very hard-pressed to find anybody who thinks that it's not going to continue.
Well, look, I again would make some distinctions here. Okay, I think the US-China relationship has some rather unique characteristics. Secondly, I think China has some rather unique characteristics. And bear in mind, we ourselves have market access issues in China. I run a massive trade deficit with China. It accounts for more than 50% of my trade deficit. It's not our case that trade deficits by definition are bad or wrong. It is whether the trade deficits are an outcome of market forces, whether they reflect your competitiveness, or whether the trade deficits are an outcome of lack of fair market access. Now, in the case of India, for example, we have a very big pharma industry. We have a big IT business. They are globally successful, including in Singapore. We have very little business in China. So to me, that's not reflecting our global competitiveness. It's reflecting some other factor. So I think
that China is not giving you fair access.
Oh, absolutely.
Is the rest of the world piggybacking on America then? That America is forcing open China, forcing China to level up for various things, and therefore countries like India secretly glad?
Well, look, the Americans have made it very clear that they are in it for themselves, right? I mean, what's this phrase you keep hearing, America first? So the Americans are in it for themselves. It's a fair proposition, everybody else is in it for themselves too. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm looking at a better trade number with China. And I have some improved trade numbers, by the way, in the last year.
Is, though, the world a much more hostile world if we all very ostensibly say that we're only looking out for ourselves and that there is no such thing as a genuine win-win situation, that it becomes this antagonistic zero-sum game type thinking?
Well, it's a more competitive world, for sure. It's a more individualistic world. If you again, we come back to, do you ask me, is that a better world? Maybe not, but it's the real world.
Trade is one thing, but on the other hand, there's also the security aspect. India-US relations have changed quite a bit on the security aspect.
Sure.
Last year, in fact, your security clearance with the US for what their arms companies can sell was changed to a level that, in fact, the arms companies can treat you the way that they would a NATO ally. And that's a very big change, isn't it?
Yes, it's a big change.
Why is that?
It's a big
what
change.
What prompted that change, you think?
It's a big change which has been in the making now for about 20 years. Okay, so it didn't happen overnight. I think it's a change from both ends. On the one hand, the United States, I think, is outgrowing the post-1945 alliance world. The US realizes that to even advance American interests, they need partners and countries who are not part of the alliance system, who will never be part of the alliance system, who have an independent, very deeply independent streak, but whose interests in many ways converge with those of the United States.
What about commentators who are more harsh, though, who say that the US is actually trying to use India as part of its containment policy for China?
Well, I don't know if they are harsh or if they are harshness would imagine objectivity in judgment, which I'm not even sure I would question that. I would question it factually. I would question it attitudinally. I mean, first of all, a lot of people who say that are people who have a Cold War mindset, who have lived through containment, who have practiced containment. They practiced containment with other countries. So they are transposing their terms, their visions, their fears, their past on all of this.
Let's move now to China relations. You were recently, in fact, in China on a cultural visit as well. And yet, lurking in the not-so-distant past is Doklam. And the skirmishes, if you want, some would even say an actual conflict there. So, do you think, though, that that can continue? That India and China will be able to continue to segregate the two aspects, security and economics, in a world where it seems as if we're converging it now?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, let me set the record straight. There were no skirmishes or conflict in Doklam. There was a standoff. There were their forces, our forces, both of them in a third country. So, but I think there were lessons for both of us out of that, and one of them was that we needed to manage our relationship better, and I think we have done that in the last year. So, insofar as China is concerned, it's not that we segregate. We don't say, well, that's security and that's economics, and this is good and that's bad, or that's going well and this is difficult. We have positives on the security and political side. We have positives on the economic side. It's international politics by nature is a competitive process. You have two countries, they're neighbors, they're big neighbors. They are unique countries in a way. They are the only two countries with 1 billion people. They are old civilizational states who are reclaiming their place in history. So there are a lot of similarities, and to that extent, in a sort of very intangible but very impactful way, the space that one creates in the international system also helps the other. China is better off if there's a rise of Asia rather than just a rise of China. And the same logic applies to India as well.
Yes, because India has not been using belligerent rhetoric when it comes to the trade deficit with China.
Well, we don't use belligerent rhetoric with anybody on anything. We are nice people.
I'm afraid Pakistan might disagree, sir.
Well, look, I would suggest to you, even with Pakistan, we haven't used belligerent rhetoric. Look at theirs and look at what we are saying. But to get back to the China point, the issue for us is China is changing, India is changing. We are changing in absolute terms. Our capabilities and our aspirations, ambitions are growing. We are changing in relative terms to the world. Now, our challenge is, if both of us are going up and not obviously at the same speed, how do you reach the equilibriums which keep it stable in that process? I think that's really the challenge of diplomacy, and I believe that we certainly are very conscious of it.
What kind of superpower would India like China to be?
We would have an intuitive feel which others would not, mainly because there is history, there is civilization, there are traditions on which you are building. So conceptually, there is a lot that is happening out there which I think a thinking Indian can relate to. There would be areas which are not, because the Indian civilization is very distinct and different from the Chinese one. But I think for us, it would, we would certainly hope, if we are all striving for a multipolar world, first of all, that you have a multipolar Asia. We would hope that the world is really as we both go up the ladder, that we would both be consultative, be take into account the reasonable interests of other countries. I mean, to my mind, that's a good way of building a more permanent global order. What do you mean by making it worse? Look at the last 25 years, 30 years. Do you know how many people have died in Kashmir?
But if we're talking about persuasion and consultation, then why was this an appropriate time to change the status of Kashmir? That doesn't seem to have been terribly persuasive and consultative.
I think you are sort of mixing apples and oranges. But having said that, let me sort of come to
persuasion and consultation.
Let me come to that issue.
Inside a country and outside of a country, we show what we do outside, but what we do inside.
So absolutely. And the first point I would tell you is that whatever changes were brought about by a parliament, using parliamentary processes as per the constitution, with about 2/3 of the parliament voting for it. Now, why was it done? It was done because the clause in question, which was in a sense modified, it was the only provision of the constitution which was acknowledged explicitly, uniquely, as a temporary provision. It has the word temporary written next to it. Okay. Now, temporary means temporary, that it ends.
But why was this a particularly good time to change it, though?
I will tell you.
Because on the ground, things have not been good.
No.
There have been clashes.
Right.
You've been forced to have curfews. Okay. There have been allegations of people being hurt, and these are ordinary people as well.
Okay.
So obviously, this was not terribly smooth, happy, amenable to the people who actually live in Kashmir.
So you asked me why now. So let me ask you. We did this about a month ago. What was Kashmir like before that month? Okay, because somewhere in your question is a latent suggestion that things were fine, you did something, and oh my God, something's gone wrong.
No, it's made it worse.
No. Oh, really? What do you mean by making it worse? Look at the last 25 years, 30 years. Do you know how many people have died in Kashmir? 40,000. 40,000. Okay. You look at the resources poured into Kashmir. Look at the effort it takes to fight off terrorism, and look at the fact that a lot of it is fed from outside. Okay. Now,
you're pointing the finger at Pakistan.
Sorry?
You're pointing the finger at Pakistan.
Oh, absolutely. I'm pointing more than a finger at Pakistan. So, and mind you, it's not that they are in denial. They themselves say that, look, we are involved in Kashmir, we support what's happening, etc. And everybody knows, those terrorist camps are not a secret. They are all activities conducted in broad daylight. So now you ask me why now? You had a government coming into power after elections with a very strong mandate, which explicitly in its manifesto said, we're going to do this. Okay. And guess what? Actually, this government likes to do what it promises people. I know it's unusual in politics, but they did it. Okay. Now, what was the necessity to do it? See, what was happening with the old constitutional provision was that it had erected a barrier in many ways, where because of local ownership regulations, because of the fact that a lot of national laws didn't apply, Kashmir was socially out of sync with the rest of the country. a lot of progressive legislation on women's rights, legislation on domestic violence, legislation on child protection, legislation on affirmative action. These legislation did not apply in Kashmir because the local political ethos was resistant to it. The second was that there was actually very little worthwhile economic opportunity which would provide jobs in Kashmir. So big companies, I mean, if you go to India, one of the things which strikes you today is a lot of economic energy. Okay, that any other province of India, there's a buzz.
Yeah, Kashmir did not share in that.
Yeah, Kashmir
much
did not.
much lower
Sure.
income.
Now, what happened when Kashmir did not share in that was that people didn't get jobs. Okay, so now they blamed Delhi in a sense, you know. So the actually what was initially meant as a comfort provision to align Kashmir with the rest of the country ended up as a barrier, which actually, you know, created a sense of mental, you know, separateness from that in many quarters.
So the question will definitely be, when is it going to be better in Kashmir? So when will Kashmiris be able to see the jobs that you're promising, the better schools, reduction in domestic violence, all of these issues? When are these good times going to come?
Look, I think they will come progressively. Obviously, all the changes that we brought about will only be effective if the people of that region accept it and believe it and see the results of it. So now, if you look at the last 3 or 4 days, you can already see that there's been an easing up of the situation. Communications are steadily being restored, that, you know, a lot of the controls which were there are progressively being lifted. You know, shops are opening up, schools are opening up. If you look at one index, which is people's withdrawal of money from ATMs, that's gone up, you know. So if you ask me, I would say look at the direction. The direction is towards normalization. Already there are efforts, for example, to call on Indian industries to invest more in Kashmir, to create jobs in Kashmir. Today, Kashmiris go out of the state for their education, they go out of the state for medical treatment, they go out of the state for jobs. So, you know, that's not good for us, it's not good for them. So this is an effort at actually saying, look, the old way of doing it is not working. Let's be honest enough, courageous enough to accept that. Let's try something different. The people of Kashmir deserve this.
Minister, thank you very much.